I think we're going to get started. Thank you very much for coming. I would like to thank Mel Chen and Suzanne for all the work they've done to organize this. It's quite thrilling to be here. And I also would like to thank the folks who may not be here, but who helped set up not only the conference, but the space, and who take care of the space. And I would like to thank all of you for coming. I feel like much of what I know or want to know is from folks here in the Bay Area, so it's a great delight to be here with y'all. One of the things that disability studies encourages is thinking about the way design is a series of political decisions that could be made otherwise. So in the spirit of making academic spaces like this one, making the design of them more apparent, I have a few access notes before I start. So I have a couple of access copies for my paper. If having a script to follow would be easier for anyone, I have a couple of medium-sized print and one large print. If anybody needs one of those, just signal. And my teachers in disability studies and disability movements have also taught me the importance of thinking about access as a collective activity made up by all the people in this space. So please do whatever you need while I'm talking to be able to be in this space. You may lie on the floor, you can lean against the wall, you can come and go. Part of what makes spaces inclusive and accessible is the ability to move around and to exit them as you need. So I will actually be quite delighted if I see you fidgeting and moving around, because I'll know you're claiming the space. So thanks for doing that. And this volume and pacing is still okay? All right, so let me know if that changes. Finally, the last access note is that I have quite a few images that I'm going to show, and I will verbally describe them as they show up on the screen behind me. This is a key practice of making visual imagery more accessible to more people, but it's also a way of sort of thinking through what's the relationship between seeing and knowing. So when you see the slides on screen, or you hear the descriptions, I encourage you to also think about how you might describe these images and how to different kinds of approaches to description encourage different or generate different effective responses to a piece. So I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes, and I'm going to do three things in the talk. First, I'm going to briefly explain what I mean by some of the keywords and frameworks in the talk. So I'm going to talk about disability, I'm going to talk about intimacy, I'm going to talk about kin, relationality, and I'll also briefly introduce the two artists whose work I'm going to be talking about, Sonora Taylor and Chun or Sandy Yi. Then the bulk of the paper is going to focus on the work of those two artists who I think are making kin and crafting crip intimacy through their art-making practice. And then I'm going to return at the end briefly to the keywords and speculate a little bit on what I think it might mean to make crip kin manifest. In this untitled oil painting on canvas, 12 inches square, a reddish, loosely L-shaped object sits against a beige background. Its heft and position perhaps initially suggest a foot, but on closer inspection, it becomes a gnarled hand whose thumb curves around and over its middle fingers. The thick thumbnail matches the brushstrokes of the background, seemingly empty, but pulsing with the energy of negative space. The concentration of brushstrokes around the bottom of the hand suggests the hand is resting on the surface of the paint itself. Although the hand is twisted in shape and the brushstrokes are expressive in color, burnt oranges, reds, and browns, punctuated by tiny hints of white, turquoise, and gray, the hand appears smooth. The paint is applied lightly enough in places that the white of the canvas appears through. This painting currently sits in a drawer in my closet. It is one of my dearest possessions. It is not something I want to see every day. Every few months, I think about hanging it. Every few months, I postpone that decision for another day. It is my right hand in this painting. And artist Sonora Taylor painted it based on a series of nude photographs she took of me about 10 years ago in a backyard in Oakland. Although I was the only one naked that afternoon, the shoot was an exercise in mutual vulnerability. We were still getting to know each other, feeling the edges of our relation. And she was trusting me with her art practice as much as I was trusting her with my body. There is something delightfully queer and appropriately crip about the fact that this painting is the only painting Taylor ever made from those photos. A painting that neither required nor reveals nudity. there is something equally queer crip about the fact that it remains deeply, if lovingly, closeted. Next to my closet is my desk, and on that desk sits a stamped and self-addressed manila envelope, an empty Ziploc bag, a zine by artist Sandy Yee, and a letter from Yee requesting a lock of my pubic hair for an upcoming project about harassment, violence, and abuse. She has asked for a story to accompany the hair, gesturing toward how violence and oppression are tangled in and through our body hair or lack thereof. But the envelope, the bag, the zine, and the letter have been sitting there for months now. I picked them up only to put them back down again. I want to respond, to contribute, to share, and yet I can't bring myself to sit down with scissors and notebook. Yee knows this hesitation well. It runs throughout the process, and she waits. Queer crip intimacies are patient, shot through with the hesitations and fits and starts and rushes of crip time. I begin with these two stories because I think they reflect some of the themes of this conference. These are stories of intimacy and relation, of sensuality and sensuousness, but they are not stories of sex per se. They are stories that point to how thinking about sexuality and working to include every body will entail vulnerability, trust, intimacy, and histories of trauma and violence. They are stories that gesture toward the importance of witnessing and co-presence, the coexistence of pride and shame, the possibilities of creating alternative futurities through art making, collaboration, and relation. And the call for papers for this conference, the organizers call, quote, to a multitude of bodies, recognizing the potential for thinking through, substituting, revisioning, and ultimately holding space for bodies that exceed categorical legislation and rhetorical disciplinarity, unquote. They go on to call for attention both to sensuousness and to the possibilities that given languages about sex and meaning might be inadequate when it comes to disability, debility, and asexuality. How are these two artists, in and through their relations with each other and their kin, crafting different languages and vocabularies for sensuousness and intimacy that move beyond our given languages for sexuality and meaning? How are they holding space for vulnerability and pain? My questions are inspired in part by the work of disability justice theorists, activists, and artists who foreground the importance of intersectionality, vulnerability, and interdependence in their work. In imagining the possibilities of crip intimacies and queer crip kin, I'm heavily influenced by Mia Mingus's work on access intimacy and the radically transformative potential of vulnerability and interdependence. Disability studies scholar Gina Kim describes crip of color critique in similar terms, explaining that such an approach, quote, reads for the means through which lives are enriched, enabled, and made possible. It honors vulnerability, disability, and interdependency, instead of viewing such conditions as evidence of political failure or weakness. It highlights modes of affirming, organizing, and supporting racialized life in which self-sufficiency no longer registers as an ideal. In thinking about making manifest crip kin, I am also thinking through the work of queer, indigenous, and critical ethnic studies scholars who have long approached kin as encompassing more than the biological or reproductive. As Juana Maria Rodriguez urges, we need to, quote, expand our definitions of affiliation, unquote, to include the deep affective ties that do not map onto heteronormative, homonormative, or reproductive categories. Moreover, as scholars from Kim Tallbear to Mel Chen to En-Jung Kim argue, these affiliative practices necessarily must question the reach of the human, recognizing the queer possibilities of animacy and intimacy with other presences and entities. I want to suggest that this expansive framing of making kin aligns with a relational approach to disability, or framing disability in terms of affective ties, relationships, and becoming with. A crip orientation positions disability as relational, meaning that disability appears in the relations among people, objects, organisms, policies, architectures, structures, beliefs, technologies, and machines. This definitional move allows us to see disability as shifting, contingent, and unpredictable, rather than as a static thing that can be definitively diagnosed, located, treated, fixed, or accommodated. We can use this notion of relation to zoom in on how disability affects whole families and communities, rather than just the individual who has the disability. Thinking, in other words, about disability and relationships and as part of kinship networks, not to mention questioning what it means to have or not have a disability. Understanding disability as relational also allows us to recognize that the illness and disability caused by dangerous working conditions, inadequate health care, state violence, and poisoned water supplies affect not only individuals but whole ecologies. In this talk, I explore the possibilities of art making as a site of and for crip intimacies and the crafting of crip kin. I focus on the work of artists Taylor and Yee, two artists who are engaged in what Ruha Benjamin calls informed refusals, which combine a critique of what is with a vision of what can and should be. Artists, in other words, who are working toward crip kin, making crip kin manifest in the early 21st century. Both women are using art making as a way to create, conjure, imagine, and support queer, crip of color intimacies, to imagine other modes and languages for desire. And this centering of crip artists as producers of knowledge and theory, and looking at cultural productions that offer sideways approaches to technology and desire, can we trace resonances with other theories and orientations? And what would it mean to treat those resonances as relations meriting care? I have chosen to focus on Taylor and Yee in part because their work resonates with the questions of intimacy and kin-making I am interested in exploring here. But I've also selected them because, as my introductory anecdote suggests, I am in long-term, non-monogamous relationships with them and their work. We share queer intimacies and queer relations. We share crip intimacies and crip relations. Intellectual and political intimacies can also be sensual intimacies, the deep pleasures of entering and being entered by another's thoughts and words. I highlight these relations as a way of marking that who these artists are, or rather who and what they are with, is key to their crip kin-making practices. And what follows, my ruminations are deeply partial, befitting a feminist queer crip examination of collaborative kin-making and crip intimacies. Sonora Taylor is perhaps best known for her rich oil paintings of animals, human and non-human. But here I want to focus on a recent series of quick, notebook-sized watercolors depicting power wheelchairs. In each of these paintings, the chairs are depicted alone, without their riders, set free. Or perhaps they have been abandoned, left to their own devices, growing into something else. Wheelchairs on the Moon is a whimsical drawing of exactly that. 5 yellow wheelchairs on the surface of a blue moon, with a yellowish starry sky in the background. In Furry Wheelchair, Taylor has created a more earthern landscape, shades of brown blending into green. And the center of the page is a gray travel wheelchair, covered in hair. Those familiar with Taylor's work will recognize those hairs as the same spiky hair that she paints on the legs of her self-portraits. Hairy Wheelchair sits in a slightly darker landscape, more brown than green, and takes up more of the frame. The spiky hair from the previous painting has here grown long and wavy. It gently unfurls from every surface of the chair. The hairs have grown even longer in Arctic Wheelchair, where the power chair is now taking up most of the page, its long snow-covered fur blowing in the icy blue wind. When I first saw these paintings, I laughed out loud. All these wheelchairs moving through the universe, going wherever they want. Taylor throws a wrench in the ableist concept of wheelchair bound, untethering body from chair. But the chairs still bear the traces of their owners, remember Taylor's hairs. And so the images also point toward the intimate relationships many crips develop with their equipment. Those who experience our wheelchairs as extensions of our bodies, as animate, as intimates. But the images are also haunting. What happened to these chairs' companions? Did they disappear, or did they merge fully with chair? Are those hairs the sign that Taylor and the chair have become one? And here Taylor pushes our questions of solidarity and community even further, exploring what it might mean to forge relationships not only beyond the human, but beyond the organism, beyond what gets marked as living. Wheelchairs on the Moon, for example, imagines wheelchairs in relation only to each other and the landscape, nary a human in sight. 5 wheelchairs forging their own joyful intimacy with each other, turning and circling and holding still. These wheelchairs beckon. Even the more solitary, furry, and hairy and Arctic wheelchairs evoke questions about what they might feel like to inhabit or ride. Although there may be no people visible in these chairs, they are anything but empty. They bristle with animacy and presence. Taylor's wheelchair paintings do what Chen describes as the queer work of reframing the terms of intimacy itself, so that it might not be restricted to operating between only human or animate entities. These paintings encourage us to recognize that technologies, even medical ones, even serious life-saving ones, can be used differently, queerly. We can begin to raise serious life or death questions about what wheelchairs or breathing tubes are for, about how they might be used in ways that do not simply run counter to their intended purpose, as if for or against were our only options, but in completely different directions altogether. Perhaps functional technologies can be used purely for pleasure, questioning which affects are associated with which technologies. What might it mean to treat deadly serious technologies, the very tools that keep us alive, with joy, delight, and wonder, with desire? I love my feeding tube, writes a disability activist in a posting about queer crip desire. And people don't understand at all how I could feel that way about a couple of tubes inserted into my abdomen to add and remove things from my body. But I do. I love my tubes so much. I wish I could write amazing poems about my feeding tube. How might we take this person's love for their feeding tube more seriously? Feeding and breathing tubes are often the technologies that people fear go too far, rendering life not worth living, draining it of its quality. Can we recognize the radical potential of insisting on intimacy, relationality, and animacy at the very points where life is presumed to end? It would be a lie to say that I don't hunger for more images of crips, freaks, weirdos, and queers claiming and reclaiming beauty for ourselves, boldly and brashly owning sexiness in and from and with odd minds and bodies. From that place of hunger, I want to recognize the work artist Sandy Yee has done to insert her body into discourses of femme beauty and sexuality. Her pieces, Armed and Beautiful and Can I Be Sexy for Once, draw on the visual vocabularies of the fashion glamour shot to position her body as assertively sexy and sexual. And if you aren't familiar with them, you can find them on her website, which I've listed here, www.cripcouture.org. What I want to focus on today, however, are her works that aren't explicitly about sexuality or quote-unquote sexiness, but are very much about creating space, making room for the bodies referenced by this conference. Some of this work is beautiful, and some of it is intended to challenge and expand our ideas of beauty and sexiness. But some of it also gets at what Mia Mingus describes as the magnificence of the ugly. Yee creates what she calls adornments for disabled bodies, wearable pieces of art intended to showcase different bodily formations rather than correct or hide them. The interaction between body and adornment is then carefully documented in large-scale color photographs. In an untitled self-portrait in the Gloves for Two series, Yee sits against a black background with her gloved hands positioned next to her bare feet. All four, hands and feet, having only 2 digits each. Yee's handmade multicolored gloves faithfully follow the contours of her hands until they reach the ends of her fingers, at which point they extend into cascading knots of varying sizes. And their fantastic colorful excess, the gloves refuse the notion that designing for disability can always and only mean designing for normativity and functionality. Drawing on the vocabulary of her own body and the bodies of her relatives, as members of her family have been born this way for generations, Yi imagines a different kind of family heirloom. And rejecting the narratives that have been handed down to her about these bodily formations, they are sites of shame, necessitating disguise and hiding, she creates adornments to showcase those very shapes. Through these designs, she has found kinship with ancestors she was supposed to forget, and made new kin with the artists and objects around her. As part of her kin-making work, Yi created a series of intimate adornments for other disabled artists. Working in close collaboration, she embarked on nothing less than what she calls bodily reconfiguration, through mapping the memories and the living experiences of her collaborators. Embrace features Sonora Taylor seated with her hands resting gently in her lap. Her light-skinned hands are encased in white plastic braces that culminate in white fabric cuffs with ivory, pink, and coral embroidery. After hearing Taylor describe childhood doctors' desires to straighten out her hands, a straightening that understood function in only the most narrow of ways, Yi created these cuffs to facilitate not movement, but aesthetic and sensory pleasure. In so doing, she and Taylor subtly refused the standard rubrics by which the progress of braces is normally measured, as a way of capacitating a disabled person into productivity through work made possible by a brace, and normativity through surgeries made possible by a brace. This refusal is more apparent when we link Taylor's desire for such braces with her essay, The Right Not to Work, in which she interrogates the notion that disabled people merit services only on the grounds that such services can then mobilize them into productive workers and consumers. Embrace functions instead as what Holness and Rudstrom call slow technology, or technologies that implicitly and explicitly facilitate reflection over consumption, productivity, and accumulation. Yi's contention that medical technologies, such as custom orthotics, can be made not for capitalist function, but for pleasure, is evident when we examine the inside of Taylor's braces. While the outside of the brace resembles a conventional plastic orthotic, the inside is lined with delicate pink and coral embroidery, echoing the stitching on the cuffs. The embroidered ivory and salmon loops are grouped together in small bunches, evoking collections of cells or fields of flowers. These tiny dots of thread are meant for Taylor's pleasure alone. They are meant to be felt, and they can be felt fully only by someone with Taylor's precise form. Yi and Taylor play with questions of visibility. Rather than create an armor for Taylor, shielding her hands from view, the braces draw attention to her hands' soft inward turn, showcasing their curve, while simultaneously providing hidden comfort. The embroidered knots are a way for Yi and Taylor to communicate with each other, sharing their experience of being the object of voyeuristic attention. Yi's hands leave their traces, caressing Taylor's skin through soft knots of thread. Yi's desire to create soft cradles for Taylor's hands deepens in meaning when read in the context of Taylor's biography and activism. In her book, Beast of Burden, Animal and Disability Liberation, Taylor is intentional about telling the history of her body. One more. My disability was caused by US military pollution in the town where I was born. Everything about my story is typical. The military and its industries secretly dumping toxic chemicals and unlined pits in the ground for decades. The poor, largely non-white neighborhoods that were affected, and the fact that the pollution was directly poisoning the lands of the Tohono O'odham Nation. My body was formed with the help of toxic chemicals, heavy metals, airplane degreasers, the mundane detritus of militarization. Taylor's narrative thus disrupts the conventional distinction often made between acquired and congenital disabilities, revealing how such distinctions fall apart in the context of environmental injustice. She was, in fact, born this way, suggesting her disabilities are congenital, but her disabilities were caused by, and therefore acquired through, military pollution. By insisting that everything about her story is typical, Taylor offers a potent description of how debility is endemic or made endemic to particular communities, Taylor's desire to combine a politics of disability with a politics of debility is to assert, quote, the US military and its garbage made me disabled, and I love my body. Embrace, then, can be seen as a way for Taylor to demonstrate loving her body while demonstrating against the military-industrial complex and the US settler state. While Embrace responds to memories of medical intervention by creating braces to caress and cradle the body, other pieces in this series draw more explicit attention to what In-Jung Kim calls curative violence, or the fact that many cures have physically, psychically, and symbolically violent effects. And this self-portrait, a detail from Refuse Skin Set, Yi stands before a white background. She wears mottled yellow latex shorts that match the adornment on her right hand, which is thrust toward the viewer. The adornment cradles her two fingers. Composed of black stitching, white plastic, and latex, the adornment allows her fingers to rest in their most comfortable position. As with Embrace, this piece is part of a series of adornments made from the tools and materials of medicine. The black thread is reminiscent of sutures and staples, while the white plastic is akin to that used to make braces and splints. But rather than using sutures and hard plastic to force the body into better positions, with better measured entirely by normalizing criteria, Yi supports bodies in moving where and how they want, including not moving at all. In contrast to the normalizing imperatives of neoliberalism, in which productivity and mobility must be enhanced at all costs, Yi allows herself the pleasure of stillness. In the photographs documenting Refuse Skin Set, Yi stands with her braced hands on her hips or crossed in front of her, apparently naked except for the shorts and finger cradles. The images have been cropped to reveal only Yi's torso. There's a tiny notch cut into the top of the shorts at the small of Yi's back, and the notch is surrounded by black suture stitches. The front of the shorts features two ovoid cutouts surrounded by white plastic. Careful examination reveals that the cuts are positioned over two long scars on Yi's light skin. Referring to the title Refuse Skin Set, we can recognize Yi's finger braces as a reference to medical practices of fusing together or refusing fingers separated during surgery or fusing together joints, freezing one set of motions to free up another. But Yi's use of black suture stitches that will never dissolve and her circling of the scars signal instead a refusal of such narratives of healing. Yi marks the violence of such interventions, highlighting their traces on her body, while gesturing toward the possibility of refusing her body back together differently, otherwise, according to a different set of logics and rubrics. Yet any such imaginings take place across the backdrop of histories of eugenics and neglect, with refuse signaling the way such bodies have been cast aside, discarded, segregated, abandoned. Although it is tempting to read these adornments as returning the body to its natural state, as freeing it from the effects of curative violence, Yi and her collaborators resist such readings. As Taylor insists, her body, like all bodies, was never natural, and Yi explains that her work is not about abandoning modification. She is less interested in rejecting the notion of physical alteration than in imagining alterations beyond a correctional physical aid. Moreover, both Yi and her collaborators know that the biomedical interventions which they are challenging are irreversible. As the scars peering out of Yi's shorts demonstrate, interventions leave permanent marks, both physical and psychic. The last piece in this series, Dermis Footwear, consists of two knee-high boots made from latex, cork, plastic, fabric, and black thread. The latex is constructed from castings of artist Sadie Wilcox's burn scars. In this series of color photographs, the boots are featured from different angles, but in all of them, Wilcox is wearing the boots. The images show her bare legs from mid-thigh down, and two of the images reveal her mint green toenails poking out through the ends of the boots. The boots are made of a caramel-colored latex, creating a dark contrast of Wilcox's white skin. And there are black suture stitches traveling around the boot in irregular patterns. There are asymmetrical cutouts in the boot skin across the top of Wilcox's feet, some suture stitched, some not, and the skin of the human shows through. The skin, the human skin, is white, brown, and pink. The swirls, bumps, and ridges of the scars are echoed in the mottled patterns of the boot skin, demonstrating Yee's interest in creating, quote, a tool for remapping and engaging with the new physical terrain, unquote. The boots present scars as patterns to emulate, as sources of artistic inspiration and sites of collaborative dialogue. The skin in these photographs is in motion. The tops of the boots are falling over and peeling back. It is as if the boots of their own accord are recoiling from the fragile, vulnerable skin beneath. Or perhaps we are to read the peeling back as a sign of healing, the way scabs start to lift and curl at the edges to make room for new skin underneath. Is the peeling away, the falling down, the collapsing, painful or liberating or both? Or have Yee and Wilcox drawn on the language of debridement, the removal of dead tissue from wounds, as a way to reimagine the healing of skin? Rather than the medical process of painful debriding, we get an animal one, reimagining debriding as a lizard or snake shedding its skin. But the skin beneath is neither fresh nor new. Underneath the cast scars, we find still more scars. These masks of violence will never disappear, no matter how many times these chrysalis boots are donned or doffed. In stark contrast to the delicate embroidery and embrace, the stitching and refused skin set and dermis footwear is thick, harsh, brash. It seems hurried, as if done out of anger or urgency. Without these suture stitches, this skin will fall apart. As Misha Cardenas notes in her description of a trans of color poetics, the stitch brings the affect of pain into our theories, allowing for the possibility of creating relations through the stitch. But Yee's pairing of the stitch with the cut and her use of stitches that will never dissolve or be removed refuses notions of such relations as creating quick or permanent healing. Moreover, Yee's slashing stitches and rough edges can be read as her rebuke of the racist imperialist reduction of Asian women to nimble fingers, and its racist ableist assumption that in Injun Kim's words, to be properly human as a woman of color is to be equipped with capacities exploitable in global production. The urgency of this creation, the skill in these stitches, is neither exportable nor replicable, but arises out of the kin-making of these artists, their bodies, histories, and tools. Yee's adornments thus rework and reimagine from queer crip perspectives what counts as expertise, and who has the authority to intervene in the form and function of bodies racialized and marked as disabled. Yee deploys the tools, vocabulary, and appearance of medical technologies, orthotic plastics, suture stitches, grafted sheets of skin, to map the traces of medicalized violence and its effects. With her collaborators, she uses these tools and materials to tell and retell stories, shifting the center of gravity and positioning themselves as producers of knowledge. Yee's focus on skin making merits attention, given skin's predominance as a marker for race and a sign of natural biological difference. Yee's assertion of expertise and authority here, the ability to make skin, the power to shift its appearance and effects, suggests that she is seizing the tools to mark the world that marked her as other, to quote Haraway. She makes clear that skin and its meanings are made. Casting custom orthotics or creating new skin does not have to be done in a laboratory, in isolation from the people served by such practices, but can be made in collaboration, in relation, in kinship networks, a collaboration based in effective ties. I want to encourage close attention to the images of these adornments as well. And publicly presenting this work, Yee has exhibited the adornments and these photographs together, making clear that the images are essential to her overall project. We can therefore read her careful cropping, excluding heads and faces from the frame, for example, as doing part of the work of mapping the memories and living experiences of herself and her collaborators. In contrast to what painter Riva Lehrer describes as specimen paintings, which turn disabled bodies into disembodied parts and promote voyeuristic access to sites of impairment, Yi has cropped the images to highlight sites of care, desire, and adornment. The relationship that matters here is not between viewer and viewed, but between artist and artist, or even wearer and worn. Even the more confrontational image of Yi thrusting her finger cradle to the camera insists on the primacy of her connection to the hand brace itself. Perhaps we can read the refusal of eye contact in these images as a sign that these adornments and photographs were created with crip audiences in mind. Yi is not ultimately concerned with navigating the stare across difference or addressing the curiosity of non-disabled people. She's instead offering other queer crips the time and space to imagine inhabiting disabilities, technologies, and medicalized histories differently. Cognizant of histories of medical surveillance, ones that overlap with histories of racialized and gendered surveillance, Yi knows that granting full visibility is not always transgressive or liberatory. Refusing eye contact also requires viewers to stay with the adornments themselves and their relations with the bodies they cradle, cushion, brace, accentuate, mirror, reveal, and reflect. Although Yi describes her work as finding beauty in these bodies, her materials, hard, white, bulbous plastic, thick black thread, her methods, jagged stitches, irregular shapes, mottled colors, and positions, jutting hand, collapsing boots, suggest that she is after more than one effective response. A deep ambivalence runs through these adornments and their photographs, an awareness that mapping the memories and the living experiences of these crips means capturing also the moments that recognition brings not identification, but refusal. The desire is often accompanied by disgust. And in reclaiming beauty, cautions Caleb Luna, who, and what I would add, are the ugly we are leaving behind. When I look at dermis footwear, I see skin that resembles my own, and I am moved by the loving care Yi and Wilcox put into creating latex skin that accentuates burned, scarred skin. But I am moved in more than one direction, and this sense of recognition is neither easy nor complete. I begin to imagine multiplying, radiating answers to Jose Esteban Munoz's question, how might subalterns feel each other? Looking closely at these boots, the way they peel back and collapse, their repeated piercing by that black suture thread, I am made aware of the persistence of deeply embodied memories that I have no desire to surface, memories that I fear, if awakened, will carry me off forever. These fears likely bind me to others encountering these images, a knotted kinship of experiences unspeakable. But again, this recognition is neither easy nor complete. When does holding space for bodies that exceed categorical legislation and rhetorical disciplinarity, to quote the conference CFP, require not only sensuousness, but its refusal? How are some of us only able to feel some things by allowing ourselves not to feel others? And how might we support other crip queer kin or form intimacies formed and not feeling? What makes this work queer or crip? I could point to Taylor, Wilcox, and Yi's identifications and affiliations, or highlight dimensions of their biographies and histories. But both moves would solidify those terms in ways that run counter to the work itself. It's all right, thank you. Munoz imagines a position or narrative of being and becoming that can resist the pull of identitarian models of relationality. And it's that unfolding of different models of relationality, of relation, of kin that resonates here. These women are collaboratively crafting relations in and through their art, deeply intimate and lively relations that are not easily reducible to family or nation or reproduction or identity. They are attending to, in Munoz's framing, quote, the receptors we use to hear each other, and the frequencies on which certain subalterns speak and are heard, or more importantly, felt. Perhaps these are the frequencies on which, through which, we can move toward more disruptive modes of organizing life together, cultivating the insurgent space and poetics of survival that Kim describes as the work of crip of color critique. Of necessity, a poetics of survival takes many forms. Kim herself uses several different words to get at the same thing: world-making, speculative projects, poems, space. And it seems worth noting here that Munoz draws on the language of frequencies, evoking both sound and currents, all unseen. I have tried to convey in words what these different images, objects, and relations look like in order to make the images and my understanding of their meanings more accessible to more of you. But radical accessibility, speculative fabulation, queer crip-kin relations, and more than human intimacy and animacy likely require a neuro-queer sensorium. Melanie Yergo admits that, quote, there is much that I do not learn or experience when I avert my eyes. And yet there is much that I do learn, do experience, do feel and intimate and express and attract and repel. I might not know or recognize your face, but I know your scent, what you wore last Thursday, the exact date on which we first met, the rhythm of your pace, the resting cut of your hair against your shoulder, the pulsing force field of the space between our bodies. They are intimacies and knowledges that exceed the eye to eye. When Yi invited me to her studio to see more of her skins, my response was not to spread them out so as to see their gradations and color or size, but to rub them against my arm, my cheek, my lips. I kept placing them on my own body, layering, repositioning, and sliding them along my skin. They were cool to the touch, but warmed quickly against my body. They slid smoothly and easily across my mouth, and my lips coasted across them. I cannot remember their making a sound, but I recall they smelled alive. They felt lively. Feel these adornments across your skin. Imagine what relation tastes like. Thank you. So I think we have about 45 minutes, 40 minutes for a Q&A, is that right?
Yeah, we have a while.
Which I don't think we'll use all of, but
Yeah,
feel free to try.
Alison, wonderful work.
Thank you.
It's not really a question, but I'm just wondering what kind of ethnic background of Yi is?
She's from Taiwan.
She's from Taiwan, so because so in this case, does her this kind of ethnic background will make something different in your study? So it's not really a question. I'm just wondering about this.
Can you say more what you mean about make something different?
No, because sometimes when we try to understand, so say we try to create something in the sense of queerness, we do pay attention to the ethnic background, so or cultural background. So but she's doing something in land of the States, so that's what. It's not really a question, but just something suddenly come into my mind.
Yes, it's a great thing to come to your mind. This is work, the work that I showed is work that Yi has done here in the States. She's based in Chicago now, but she has this, I'm gonna talk around your question, but she has this series of photographs that I think took place earlier than these, where she describes and does a series of interactions with medical doctors that are coming from her experiences in Taiwan. She also has a piece that the gloves, the very first photograph I showed with the gloves, is part of another series where she made a whole bunch of gloves with everything from 0 fingers to 6 fingers, and she hung them in a space in order to anticipate the arrival of people with different kinds of hands. And she writes about how that project in part came about learning about her relatives in Taiwan who had been shunned for their bodily formations, but also learning about histories of eugenics in Taiwan and China, and the way children with the formation she was responding to were not accepted. I do not think that's unique to Taiwan or China. That happens here in the States as well. But those are two pieces that came more directly out of that context. I do think that her background has everything to do with the work that she does. That's not something that she has written a lot about herself, which I think is also interesting, right? I also don't know that she would describe her work as queer. So there are different layers of questions about identity and affiliation that your comment is generating that I think I might answer differently about Yi's work than Yi would answer about herself, right? Does that kind of get to some questions? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, this was such a beautiful talk. Thank you so much. I guess I want to take up with the extreme closeness that you end your talk with, the felt closeness of the fabrics, and sort of think about that alongside Donna Haraway's tentacular thinking, which is like, you know, as a meditation on a kind of body, which becomes a meditation on a kind of theoretical reach. I'm just interested in the way in which the images of embodiment that you're working with, what sort of, if they've, the sort of method that I guess is most interesting, useful, pleasurable for you to think about that sort of, the project of thinking with different bodies here.
Mm-hmm. I assume with the mic, folks in the back can hear the questions? Yes? Okay. In the panel today, you responded in part to a question by saying that you just love the work that you're writing about, right? I don't know about, I mean, I imagine many of us in this room are people who generate writing for our student or job lives, and sometimes the generation of that writing is not always pleasurable, shall I say. But when I got to just look at the images of this work and write about what I saw or what I thought I saw and what I imagined the different pieces would feel like, and imagine the conversations that took place around the formation of the adornments, that was just sheer pleasure, right? And so thinking about method, I mean, if I could spend all of my time doing that, I would be a very happy person, a much more sensuous person, much more embodied and in-minded fully person. I'm also talking around your question, which is another methodological move, right? I find Haraway's work incredibly generous and generative and exciting and frustrating in lots of different ways. One of the things that I appreciate about reading her work is that I think that she is willing to use different kinds of languages and vocabularies that draw on different kinds of knowing in a very explicit and often kind of ridiculous way. And I love that, and I would like to embrace more of the ridiculousness in my own work. I'm not always, I was gonna say I'm not always as moved, but I am moved just in different directions by the way she talks about disability and bodies. But again, I think that there might still be places for generative response and thinking about the way she also uses sort of ridiculous, unfolding, multiplying vocabularies around bodies that can be tweaked, right, and used differently. Does that?
Yeah, so much. I just love the way you began with the meditation on patience and postponement within the scene of manifestation, and the sort of like all over the place urgency of the tentacles in Haraway's.
Nice, yes.
Yeah, it was I was interested to hear about that contrast.
Yeah,
That's really beautiful.
Thank you for helping make that connection. Yeah.
Hey, hi. That was such a beautiful talk. Thank you.
So I was thinking more about Sonora Taylor's depictions of the wheelchairs that were covered in the different materials, and you were saying how there's this relation where you can love your wheelchair and yet, you know, feel the disconnect and perhaps the violence from the person who made it. That's, you know, you're not in the room when these technologies are made, and, you know, there's so histories of violence through them. And you showed some really beautiful examples of, through art, how that might be mitigated, but I was wondering in everyday life how that contradiction might be mitigated as well.
Yeah, these are good questions. There are lots of folks doing work, both scholarly and activist, and activist, scholarly activist, around questions of crip design. I see that Karen is here, so Karen knows a lot of this work too. But there are folks who are sort of looking at crip expertise and crip hacktivism, who are actually like, how are people taking their wheelchairs and completely turning them to other things? Designer Sarah Hendren talks, for example, about equipping a bike with a cane rack, I think, and how that sort of shifts our understanding of who can ride a bike and what a bike is for, right? So I think that that is some of that work, that the bike itself might not have been created with crip minds and bodies in mind, but can be used differently. I mean, all of us hack our technology in really creative ways. We just don't always give ourselves credit for that. But it happens around disability technologies just like it happens around everything else. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm so absorbed in the answer.
Thanks for running the mic, Suzanne.
Yeah. This actually is in response to that previous question, but it's on another one, which is Sunny recently had a thread on her Facebook about different types of gaze. And I was wondering if you could respond to this about the gaze of sort of the intimate partner, the gaze of the doctor, the gaze of strangers, the gaze of crip family, and how that affects especially public artists, but also disabled people moving through different spaces, and how we manage to handle those different types of gazes in ways that are both true to ourselves, in the spirit of trying to allow non-disabled people to understand our spaces, but also to protect ourselves from the violation of our physicality.
Did you want to say something? I know. I was just gonna, this confession has gotten much easier in the last couple of weeks, given what's going on. But I'm not on Facebook and never have, so I have no idea that Sandy had posted this. I'll have to ask her about that. So I can't speak to what she said directly, but that's a great question.
So I think the impetus is strangers gaze upon crip bodies, doctors gaze very intimately upon crip bodies, and our lovers gaze intimately upon us. And in many ways, it is the same gaze, but it's very different. And our reactions to that are very different and complex. And I was wondering if you could touch upon that, especially because the photographs you have are both very, very intimate, but mean very different things to the people who look at them. And in some ways, being a public artist means you don't have control over that anymore.
That's a book of a question. And I mean that in the best possible way. Some of the earliest work that I did when I was a graduate student was about devotees, so people who consider themselves to be sexually oriented around disability, and particularly amputees. And one of the reasons, I don't usually think of it this way, but one of the reasons I don't do social media, I think, is in part because of my long history with devotees, a long unwanted history with devotees. And so this question of the gaze and what happens when different people from different positionalities and with different orientations and different intentions see the same images is fraught across a whole range of communities for lots of different histories and lots of different reasons. But I learned about devotees, so I learned about this particular kind of gaze at the same time that I was learning to be in the particular body that I inhabit now. And so I feel like I have never seen the body that I have now without knowing of that particular gaze being upon it. And I don't think that has been a joyous or helpful or nurturing or loving position from which to learn how to be in a particular embodiment. And again, I think lots of us think of different ways this connects around different kinds of oppressive, violent gazes. So then to think about what does it mean to be a public artist making art that showcases bodies that have been seen unwillingly, gets really complicated, right? So I think there are lots of reasons why Sonora Taylor has never made other photographs based on that photo shoot that she did with me, but I do think part of it is her consciousness of what does it mean to generate images of amputee bodies in this particular culture. And at the same time, I'm really talking around your question. Corbett O'Toole's in the back and is a longtime disability activist and was one of my mentors in the disability community. And one of the first things that she said to me, probably the first hour that we met, and that she probably would continue to say to me every single time she could if she had the chance, is to tell me to stop making work for non-disabled people and to make work for other crips about us. That's not about explaining disability to non-disabled people, but is about describing what disability feels like on the inside. For lots of different reasons, I have failed her in that repeatedly over and over and over again, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not. But when I think about your question, I understand why she asks me that over and over and over again. And I will always be grateful for the reminder, even as I continue to fail willfully and not in doing that work. It is a complicated, hard, violent, terrifying, and also enriching and wonderful and sexy and fabulous thing to be a body in the world. All of those things at once, always at once. Does that kind of help your question?
Hi, this is Corbett. You never disappoint me, honey. I wanted to speak to a couple of things, but I actually really wanted to invite the people that in the audience to kind of help me think through some of this. So in terms of disability imagery and this kind of intimate imagery, there's very little of it in the world. I mean, we have these two artists and we have almost nobody else. So we're kind of forced to eat from, you know, a buffet of a few plates with very few choices. And that has profound impact on our ability to imagine ourselves and move forward as bodies in the world when we're being assaulted with the medical system. You know, you're too fat, you're too skinny, you're too this, you're too that. And we're gonna fix you in these kind of medicalized ways. So it's really important for us to have pushback, and we have very little of it visually. And so these artists are really engaging with that. And I don't know if you noticed, and I don't think, Alison, you commented on it, that in Sandy Yee's piece with her feet, she's in full high couture makeup. And so she does a whole piece where she's basically really glammed out. And I think it's interesting to kind of have this contrast of this very glamorous, sexual, beautiful body and these atypical body parts that she's also choosing to highlight. And for me, I'm also a visual artist. I'm really interested for those of you who have seen these images, maybe for the first time, or maybe for the first time are going to be thinking about this. What's the words? What's the language? How does it resonate with you? Because I know how it resonates with me, but when I'm making art, I want to know what these images mean to you that can help us to kind of bridge the gaps. Because I agree, I'm going to make it for other disabled people, but I also want to know where the challenges are, where the barriers are between us as people that live in this community and live with this art and live with these bodies, and people that don't normally but want to make those connections.
I'm going to try. It's not a direct response, but looking at the last images that were up, just that kind of skit, I came in late, so it was just,
That's okay.
but there was something kind of eerie in the moment, like of just not having a context for what I was looking at. So coming to my own conclusion, and then I heard you and the skin, the sewing. So it kind of, I'll have to think about what it is that I felt that I saw. But then also, as the conversation has continued, I've just been thinking about the fourth plinth in London, and there was, I don't want to get it wrong, but there was, can I look for it and then yeah. So I don't know who the artist, I didn't know the story behind it, but just this conversation is making me reflect back on what that meant as public art, to have the fourth plinth in Trafalgar Square in London, huge public art piece that gets sort of circulated through, but there was a piece of a woman, I think she was pregnant, yeah. So I don't know the story, but I just wanted, so it's just making me think about that and what that was. No, pregnant, no legs, no arms, I believe. But the plinth is huge, so it was oversized and towering over London, basically. So I'm reflecting on what that meant for us as just walking through and seeing something that you wouldn't normally see, and just being in this space and being asked to think about it as public art, and yeah, my own practice as well. So thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm not sure that I'm gonna answer fully your question, Corbett, but I did want to kind of address, this is not my first time coming to Sandy's or Sonora's work, but I do think that part of the way, Alison, that you invite us into the piece is partially about gaze and the way that you talk about crop. But for me, coming into these specific pieces, which I haven't seen before, was a lot about the way in which Alison describes the movement of the pieces and the tactility of the pieces and the sensuality of the pieces that I feel like I was able to experience through Alison and through your kind of description and encounter with the piece. So that was partially, I think, for me, it was less a question of gaze, but perhaps more a question of sensual tactility movement, which leads me partially to my question, which is just to ask you, Alison, to speak a little bit more about this relationality and this kinship that gets surfaced or ignited in a certain way through this description of your interaction with the objects and with bodies in these various ways, and how that relationality comes about through what I see as your description of movement, but also potentially the tension of movement and stillness that you're asking us to kind of think upon.
So I might be repeating myself a little bit, but I do think that for me, one of the reasons that I think about these works as being about relationality and kinship and intimacy does in part link back to this question about gazes and histories, and that when I think about Sandy and Sonora sitting together to figure out what kinds of braces to make for Sonora, or Sandy sitting with Sadie, it's a lot of S names, to figure out what kinds of boots to make. I am certain that the conversations that they had at times drew on medicalized language, because that's often the only language we have access to. And then trying to imagine how to think those experiences and phenomena differently. And my hunch is that that happens through the art making itself and through the energy exchange between those people, but may not always happen in language itself. And I think that is a kind of movement, right? That is a movement through history. It's a movement of energies and ideas. But I think it's a movement that is made possible through what I said at the beginning about crip patience, right? That I imagine I'm not the only one in this room for whom it's true to say that you have to sit with me for a long time before I'm going to tell you what I really want to tell you. And so what does it mean to make a commitment to someone, to their body, to their mind, to their history, to their work, to do that sitting with? And how is that sitting with a kind of stillness that makes movement possible, and vice versa? Disability studies has been around for a while now, and has done amazing work, is doing amazing work, and the same is true of disability activism. And I am not the first, and I will sadly not be the last person to say this, but disability studies as a discipline in the academy has still not done enough, and I implicate myself in this. And radically shifting our ideas and understandings of what it means to generate knowledge and what counts as knowledge. And I think questions of pace and movement and stillness are huge dimensions of that. But typically this is not a place in which we are encouraged to think slowly and unevenly and with big gaps. And I think that at its best, disability studies can encourage us to do that, but so far we've not done that work in the way that we should. Which I know is tangential to your question, but I do think that on some level that's what appeals to me about, one of the things that appeals to me about this artwork is that it is unfolding at a different pace and through different temporalities, and that feels like that to me. It's just like a breath of air. Thank you for that question.
I've been reflecting on the piece, I think it's Embrace, that's Sonora's hand braces. And it's, as somebody learning to sleep with splints on my hands, it's, I don't know what the word is, but it's good for me to see this example of something beautiful that's not medical. And when you said that it is, there is comfort and pleasure in that piece that only she can experience because of the shape of her body. I mean, maybe that's basic and obvious, but it's so helpful to hear that and realize that. And so in its obviousness, it takes me out of the medical model that I am in, thinking about splints, and the relationship between Sonora and Sandy in the production of those is such a stark contrast to typical relationships between patients and providers, occupational therapists, or whoever, and to just see that that's there when, you know, I don't think of it being there, is powerful. And I'm reflecting on this advice that you've received about doing work for people with disabilities, not for other people to understand disabilities, and just thinking about my own life of being mostly surrounded by people who don't identify as people with disabilities. And so much of my life is trying to describe this experience to them. For me, I need to do that for me. And that this piece, which is maybe more for me than for them, helps me feel more comfortable talking about my experience with people who don't share as much of it. And then what you were just saying about patience, and I guess I'm thinking being new to living with a disability. I'm not even yet new being a member of a community of people with disabilities, that, you know, I don't have a sense of that community, that there's this scarcity feeling, or this, that there's a mentors or elders on this path feel very precious, like that it's hard to have access to relationships and wisdom, and that art seems like a way of that communication.
Your question and comment brings me back to your question about everyday life in terms of objects. And now I can't think of what it's called. The Smithsonian Museum, I think it's just the Museum of American History. They have a curator there who is the medical history of medicine curator. And her name is Catherine Ott, and she has worked really hard to sort of cultivate relationships with disability communities and people with disabilities. And one of the things that she has worked to get the Smithsonian to collect are quote unquote medical objects that people have modified for themselves in ways that often run counter to their purpose. And so I would think that one of the reasons she's doing that is to sort of document this history of resistance, but also to leave a path for other people, right? Someone new to having a brace can look and see, here's what someone else has done with a brace, right? So I'm just acknowledging what you're asking for.
I have the mic. Could you, I was really moved that not only by the idea of the interpersonal intimacies, but that there can be an intimacy with the practice itself or with an object generated by an aesthetic practice. And I think a lot about what it means to have a practice, struggle with that, but also for art to be like at the one time like a mode of survival, but that's complex. Like the objects sometimes go in the closet and you can't look at them even though you're living with them. And I don't have, there's a sort of an open-ended, I just didn't know if you had more you wanted to say about that didn't make it into the talk, or just living with what it is to live with things that carry so much meaning, but that take on different valences.
Most relations are not straightforward or one way, right? Whether we're talking about people or objects or things or practices or habits or beliefs or histories. So an object that brings me pleasure one day may very likely bring me pain the next, right? Just like a relationship with a person may do the same thing. I love Sandy Yee's work. I love it. I love her as a person. I love what she does. I love her work. I love these adornments. I started working on portions of this talk back in the fall, and I was positive I was not going to write about the dermis footwear, which is the last piece of her work that I showed you, because I hate it. I don't like looking at it. I don't like thinking about it. I did not want to spend any time, as much as I loved describing the work, right? I did not want to spend any time describing what that work was or is. I didn't want to think about the conversation she had with Sadie. I just did not want to have anything to do with that piece. Thankfully, I have people in my community who sort of gently suggested that if you're talking about this body of work, you probably need to talk about this other piece, right? Even if I hate it. And I'm really grateful for that, because I came to, love is not the right word, but I came to be able to appreciate them and to see, I mean, this is going to sound really obvious to all of you, as a burn survivor whose skin looks like what is happening in that piece, and who has some overlapping history with Sadie, the woman whose skin is being cast. Of course I would have a fraught relationship to that work. I didn't think that was what was going on. I just didn't like the work. I'm really grateful that I sat with it and made me think about her work in a much more, I think, accurate way than I did otherwise. But it's a different version of the painting that Sunny did. I don't want those photographs hanging in my house. I don't really want to talk to Sadie about them, ever. And I'm not proud of that. I don't think that's the right attitude, and yet I feel it nonetheless. So just thinking about complicated relationships to things and to academic and scholarly objects of analysis, right? What does it mean to be afraid of what we study? And what are the kinds of ways in which we're afraid of what we study? And what are the moments in which that fear maybe tells us, yes, you need to go deeper here? And what are the moments in which that fear is telling us, you need to take good, sweet care of yourself if you're going to follow down this road, right? So, you all have been an incredibly generous audience to sit here for so long. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alison.
Yeah, thank you.